Hello, and my name is Peter Rushmer, and I'm your host today of a Half Dozen Things podcast. A Half Dozen Things is a podcast for business owners and professionals just like you. Whether you're an underdog hungry for success or you're already smashing it but want to continue to level up, we're here each week for you to get insight and learning from the very best in the business. No fluff, no BS, and no self-proclaimed gurus talking about how easy business or life is. Just real, frank, and raw conversations. Hello and welcome. I'm joined today by Christian Harris. He's the founder of Slip Safety Services and is an absolute specialist in the world of slip safety. And this session we talk about 6 tips for reducing slips in your workplace, which is one of the major contributing areas of accidents in your workplace. And what a fantastic episode and guest Christian has been for this session. So please do enjoy it. Catch you soon. I'm joined this morning by Christian Harris. Thank you for joining me, Christian, on Half Dozen Things podcast. Christian is a slip specialist, and we're going to be covering off some really interesting content today around a Chimes model and a six-step method for reducing slips in the workplace as well. So first of all, I'm just going to ask Christian, are you okay to just introduce yourself for the listeners, please, Christian?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me. I'm Christian Harris, the CEO and founder of a business called Slip Safety Services. Basically, we prevent slip and fall accidents and insurance claims in busy commercial buildings, which drives down injuries, claims costs and premiums, of course. Been doing this for over a decade now, and at last count, we were preventing about £10 million a year of insurance claims in the UK.
Wow, that's incredible, isn't it? And that just goes to show, because the next thing we were going to talk about is a little bit of context around slips in the workplace as well. So that's a significant sum of money. So talk to me a bit.
Yeah, it is, but actually it's not when you see the size of the problem. So
yeah, absolutely. Are you able to just give us a bit of context around the size of the problem, Christian?
Yeah, absolutely. So a couple of kind of headline figures from a claims perspective. So to put that 10 million into context, we work with AXA Insurance. We're their kind of approved supplier for slips and trips. And their last published data, they showed 80 million of slip claims every year, and another about 15 million of trips. But the next biggest cause of claim was manual handling, which was 30. So slips is more than double the next biggest cause of claims. And if you look at AXA's market share and you kind of extrapolate those numbers, then you're talking well over £1 billion a year of claims every year in the UK. Just from slips. So yes, 10 million sounds interesting and impressive, and it's a good achievement, don't get me wrong. But we've got a long way to go to try to reduce that overall number. Another figure that's interesting, over 300,000 people a year go to A&E after a slip, and that results in 1.5 million NHS bed days. So, lots and lots and lots of people getting hurt. And obviously that affects them personally, but it also affects their business, as well as their friends and family.
Wow, that's some big like they're big numbers. my son's 9, and he always goes to me, "What does this add this make?" And I'm like, "A big number," yeah. And that's a big number. So 80 to put that. So just so I get my context right, so 80 million, that's a pound sterling amount rather than a volume of
80 million pounds of claims. Yeah. Wow. So the average claim is about £10,000. Okay. But you do get obviously massive ones. So we've been involved in claims of over £1 million on several occasions. Not that those happen every day, because obviously with the way that the UK court system works, to get to £1 million, you've got to have a very serious injury and a massive effect on your life and a loss of earnings and things like that. But you do see big claims. And there's criminal fines as well. So in early 2020, Tesco had a criminal fine of 733,000 after someone slipped and broke their hip in one of their stores.
Wow, that's big numbers, and is obviously a big problem for many workplaces. So what types of companies do you work with then, Christian, to sort of help reduce slips in the workplace?
It's a broad range of companies that we support. Because we work with a number of insurers, we kind of get pulled in all sorts of different directions. But if you looked historically at where we've done the most work, it's probably in sectors like hospitality and leisure, retail, as in sort of I would classify shopping centres, train stations, airports as retail, and then kind of manufacturing types of facilities. In other words, where from a workshop to a food production, where workers are doing stuff and there's contamination and risk from that perspective.
Okay, brilliant. And from an insurance point of view, you're not just working reactively; you're also working proactively with bigger companies to reduce proactively their liabilities around any slip claims.
That's our desire and our wish and what we prefer to do for sure. And yes, we are doing some both for insurers and kind of directly. I think it's the big challenge really around slips is there's a mindset issue where people kind of perceive that either they're inevitable or they're perhaps not that serious, and so we have to talk about these big numbers to kind of get the seriousness of the problem known. And then we have to talk about the fact that you can do stuff to reduce them so people realise they're not inevitable. And then all of a sudden it opens up this kind of new world where people have a fresh understanding and fresh perspective, and they can start to kind of make a dent in the problem.
Absolutely. And I know those business owners listening will be listening intently, because a 10,000 average claim amount is obviously a large amount of money, but also it's the impact of lost days in the business as well, and the other challenges as well. So just talk to me a little bit, whilst we're sort of on the context, before we move into the six-step method and the Chimes model that we're going to discuss. What does that process look like? So as we stand now, if one of our listeners had a member of staff, has a slip, gets injured, is one of the 300,000 average visits to A&E, what does that process look like from a claim point of view? If a business owner's not been through that experience yet, just sort of talk us through what that may look like for them.
Yeah, so I mean, if it's a workplace scenario like that, then typically the claim notification is made quite quickly. When we're dealing with shopping centre owners and people like that, you often find that people lodge claims, coming up to that 3-year legal deadline, and then you don't have CCTV and you don't have records and whatever it might be. Yeah. You're going to get a claim notification through from a solicitor that will go to your insurer. The insurer is then going to start asking you lots of questions about what you've got in place in terms of mechanisms and processes and systems and proof of what you've done to have tried to avoid that accident from happening, and have you fulfilled your duty of care, which obviously you have an obligation to do as an employer. There's a good chance that part of that might include doing a slip test, which we can talk a little bit about. So there's a way of actually scientifically measuring how slip resistant the floor surface actually is in using a method that HSE and the courts use called a pendulum test. So that may well become part of it as well. And then, as always, with these claims, it comes down to a commercial decision in many senses. We might think that we've done everything we could have done, but you might pay them a small amount to sort of settle the claim rather than fight it and risk having to pay a larger amount. We might feel like we're banged to rights and we've got to pay them what they're asking for. Or we might feel, actually, no, we've got a very robust defence here, and actually that person was contributing quite significantly because they weren't doing what they should have done, for example, and therefore we're going to fight it. So you've then got one of those three sort of outcomes to contend with.
Got you. Fantastic. That's really insightful. Thank you. Okay, so it's now a good time for us to start to have a look at the Chimes model then. So what does that look like then, Christian?
So basically, as I said, I think people have this kind of superficial view of this problem. So what we've tried to do is, and I've been doing this for over 10 years, is kind of deconstruct the real reasons why people slip and put it into something that's meaningful and understandable and actionable. And so that's where we've come up with Chimes. So Chimes is an acronym, and it's the 6 reasons why people slip. So I can run through what it stands for, and then we can delve into some of the six or as many of them as you want to.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah. Okay.
C is for contamination. So a clean and a dry floor is a safe floor, but any kind of contamination, which could be water, grease, dry contaminants like dust or semi-solids or whatever, is going to make the floor more slippery. So contamination, how can you control that? H is heel. So if you think about someone slipping, there has to be a foot involved in it. So to what extent are you able to control what people are wearing on their feet? Or if you can't control it, you've got to bear that in mind, and perhaps you've got to put more emphasis on the other areas of Chimes. I is individual. So this is all the human factors. This is a bit more easy to control in terms of staff versus members of the public, obviously, because you can enforce people acting in a certain way when they're members of staff, but not necessarily as members of the public. But if you think about walking at a normal speed in a straight line, you require a certain amount of grip. I think people could understand that premise in their mind. Whereas if you start, running, pushing, pulling, twisting, turning, carrying, then you need more grip. M is maintenance. So this is split into three things. One of the key ones is cleaning. So how is a floor maintained from a cleaning perspective? The other two are wear and tear. So floors will change in use over time, and then change of use. So if, for example, you had a retail store on the high street and it closed down, and somebody decided to set up a butcher's in that store, that environment and the floor needs to be reconsidered, because it may have been suitable for a retailer, but it's probably not suitable for a butcher's.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Environment, so that includes things like the weather and condensation and stuff, but also the built environment, so steps and stairs, ramps and slopes, lighting, noise, things like that, and entrance matting is a big one. And then S is surface, so the floor. So if you've got a floor that is slip resistant when wet, then you've got half a chance of keeping it safe. If you've got a floor that is, like a sheet of ice or a pane of ice on the floor, and it's in a swimming pool or a workshop or a kitchen, it's going to be very difficult to keep that environment safe, because the floor is not safe when it's wet. So that's the model, and what we tend to find when we explain that to people is two reactions. One is, oh yeah, that makes perfect sense, and I can see now why there's a bit more science to this subject than I thought. And then the second reaction is, oh, actually, looking at that, we're only dealing with one or two of those, and there's a lot of work we need to do, and now we can understand why we might be struggling with slips and falls.
Yeah, absolutely. It's quite eye-opening for me, particularly as I think sort of particularly around our sort of transport customers. One of the questions I have for you, and I suppose you'd be well informed to answer the question, if one of our members of staff, say a driver, was on the back of an HGV, they often get on to be able to connect and disconnect trailers, for example, and they fell off because they'd slipped. Does that go down? Is that recorded as a slip, or is that classed as a fall from height? Is it recorded slightly differently in the statistics?
I mean, it would depend on, always a challenge around recording of these kinds of incidents, because, for example, when somebody like AXA sends us the claims history for a prospective client, it's an absolute minefield because of the way that it's tracked. And so one of the challenges is, as you've identified, are people recording things as a fall from height or as a slip? Because actually, in that case, it probably would go down as a fall from height, but the root cause of it would have been a slip.
Exactly.
And many falls from height, you don't typically just fall from height, if you know what I mean. Most falls from height have something that's actually caused them to happen. The other one is that even above that, you get people just grouping together slips, trips and falls into one big category, and then you don't really have much insight at all in terms of what you can do to try and solve that problem.
Yeah, of course. As you went through Chimes, and I was just sort of thinking about in that context, how that would affect our transport customers in particular. And from a contamination point of view, we look at oil leaks and fuel leaks, AdBlue, lots of opportunity for slippages and that kind of thing there. From a PPE point of view, that is fairly well accepted that a driver should wear non-slip
safety boots. So that's sort of not.
There's a bit of devil in the detail there, though.
Okay, fine.
Because, if you go to a PP supplier and you say I want some safety boots or some safety shoes or whatever it might be, typically they're going to have, your steel toe cap and your ankle protection and so on and so forth. And then on the bottom of the sole, they're going to have some kind of textured sole made of, whatever kind of material. And there's an EN standard for slip-resistant footwear, which pretty much all of these footwear is going to pass. But actually, the HSE or the HSL, the laboratory arm of the HSE, they've developed their own kind of footwear test called GRIP, because what they found is that the EN standard is kind of like I don't know, an 11 plus exam or a GCSE, whereas actually what you want in certain scenarios is a PhD, to use an analogy. So what people should look for is if they can get it, is a grip rating for their shoes, because that's going to be a much better test as to whether they're slip resistant or not, because safety shoe or safety boot doesn't necessarily mean slip resistant. And the two big factors are the material of the sole and the tread pattern. So you can find that think of a I don't know, an Ocado delivery driver, let's say. They might be going from the warehouse where there might be some oil or water on the floor, on a concrete or something like that. But then they might also be going out and walking on ice or snow, or they might be walking on grass, which could be slippery and wet. And actually, the tread pattern, the footwear, is going to perform differently in different environments. So, again, if I was going to sort of give one piece of advice to anybody, it would be just don't assume, and go. There is a lot of depth to this, so just go that level down and into the detail, and that's where you're going to get the biggest results.
Who knew? I'm learning stuff now. Obviously, my understanding was quite superficial, so that's good. But it's good that I'm listening and learning. But that we're starting to get into like my world, which is tires and grip ratings and different, different tires for different conditions. And I'm assuming grip ratings
are very similar. Yeah, it's very similar. So if you think about when we're measuring the slip resistance of a floor using this contraption called a pendulum test, we can include a link to a video of that in the notes if you want. It kind of it swings. It's called a pendulum because it swings, and it has a rubber foot on the back of it, and it strikes the floor. And we use two different rubbers. We use one for a bare foot and one for a shod foot, because there's a different rubber compound, because you've got difference between the hardness of a shoe versus a foot. And interestingly, when it comes to the surface, thinking of an analogy of a Formula One tyre, it kind of works similarly to that. So if you've got a very smooth floor, like a shiny marble, for example, in dry conditions, you're going to get a very high level of slip resistance for that floor, because you're going to get a huge amount of surface area contact, a bit like a slick tyre in the dry. Whereas in the wet, you get very low slip resistance. Absolutely. And the floor surface, textured floor surface, typically a bit like a wet tyre that you'd use on a Formula One car, is going to give you better grip in wet conditions. But you get an inverse correlation. So a smooth floor normally has a very high dry slip resistance and a very low wet slip resistance, and then a textured floor is sort of meeting in the middle. So you have a worse dry slip resistance, but a better, much better wet slip resistance.
I was going to say, coming from a father of a daughter who has hemiplegia, cerebral palsy, and taking her swimming is always a dice with death, because she's much more prone to slipping, because one of her legs isn't quite and fit. It doesn't meet the ground in the same way as a person without those challenges would have. And then you add in the slippery floor at a swimming pool, and she's having a nightmare. She's ended up on her backside and hitting her head and all sorts of stuff. So it's interesting actually. What do you like? What's the suggestion for swimming pools? Because certainly the local council run swimming pool, it doesn't appear that there's a lot there, other than walk carefully.
So I mean, we should all be using the same model, really. They should be considering all of these 6 factors. So, if you've got a swimming pool, contamination is obviously the floor's going to be wet, and therefore you need to be trying to maintain it in a safe condition when it's wet. But you've got things like body fats and calcium. Heel, obviously, you can't really control because people are wearing bare feet, are not wearing shoes. So you just got to be mindful of that. Individual. Yes, you can have signs up and you can ask people not to run and things like that. And obviously, there's a certain level of duty of care there. But it's really coming into maintenance and surface in those pools. So, can you get the right floor surface on the floor, and can you maintain it in the right way? Because it is possible. It's definitely possible to have a swimming pool floor that is safe when it's wet. If you just think about the fact that how many steps have you taken on pavements when it's been pouring with rain and you've not slipped over? Well, that proves that it's possible for floors to not be slippery even when they're wet. What does that mean? What makes that floor safe versus the swimming pool? Well, it's actually the floor surface, and it's how it's maintained, because what happens typically in these pools is, particularly on the pool sides, they're just not cleaned frequently enough, is the honest answer, and therefore the contamination builds up on the surface, and you get this kind of barrier of body fats and grease sitting between what is probably a pretty safe floor and your foot.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. It's that makes total sense. Okay. Okay, bro. So those are the 6 areas for which, so as a business owner, so for argument's sake, we'll go back to the transport process where a lot of the listeners will be. As a transport owner, if they start to look at when they're assessing the risk in their warehouse or storage, in their yard, those kind of areas where slips are going to occur, the Chimes model is really what they want to start to think about. So from a risk assessment point of view, they could almost put each of those 6 areas and start to look at the controls they're putting in to try and tackle those. So is that sort of how you would use that model effectively?
Exactly, spot on. And some of them do obviously interrelate. So, the floor and the contamination and the cleaning of that floor are all relating to the floor. But obviously, if you think about it, you could have the most slippery floor in the world when it was wet. If you had 100% control over the contamination, it never got wet and it never got contaminated, then it doesn't matter. So, you've got to be thinking about all of this in a kind of holistic way. What I tend to find is that people, as I said, look at maybe 1 or 2 because they haven't considered the breadth of the things that contribute to this. And thinking about your daughter, we can all walk on a slippery and wet surface, because actually most floors in entrances to buildings, or in workshops or in swimming pools are slippery. But we don't have hundreds of millions of slips here. We have hundreds of thousands. We can all walk on floors that are slippery when wet, but it's when people have issues with balance, or people don't spot the hazard, or there's a change of surface, or there's a distraction, if you're not looking properly, or if something's distracting you, or there's light, or there's noise, So again, it's layer upon layer of things that cause these problems. But from a business owner perspective, obviously your duty of care is to take reasonable steps to make these things a framework, just to sort of tick off and say, well, yeah, we're doing this, and this here, this, and this, and this. And then
perfect. The point I think I was going to make was that, particularly as I start to consider my daughter with her slipping, the key factor for her is that she hasn't got shoes on. So the shoes make a big difference to her from a heel and footwear point of view, because it actually improves her contact with the surface over and above what her bare foot will do. So that also has an impact as well. Just as I start to think about those areas, but I've carried out loads of risk assessments and never looked at the Chimes model before, so I think that will be really, really helpful for people as they start to consider certainly the safety in their workplace. So, tell me a bit more about the 6-step method then, Christian. Is now a good time for us to start to have a look at that?
Yeah, definitely. So we talk a lot about thinking of a bridge between slip and grip, which sounds a bit cheesy, but kind of making it very simple to understand. So the process that we get people to go through, the 6 steps are measure, understand, and then improve, maintain, monitor, and evidence. And the idea here is that you're looking at things holistically to try and be preventative, but you're also mindful of the fact that even if you take all reasonable steps and even if you do everything in the Chimes model really well, you still occasionally might get an accident, and therefore you want to be in the best possible position to be able to defend that claim as well. So measure is all about trying to get some science into this. So lots of those areas of Chimes, as we've talked about with heal, for example, there are ways of scientifically measuring the effectiveness of different heals in different environments and under different contaminants to give you some scientific evidence on which to base your decision making. Cleaning and the maintenance, you can use slip testing to measure the efficacy of your cleaning, but you can also use hygiene testing as well, which has come to the fore in COVID times, obviously. And I think people have now a greater understanding of the fact that just because the surface looks clean, it looks okay, it doesn't necessarily mean it is clean, because we all know that COVID is invisible, but also there are other contaminants that are invisible and that can inhibit the slip resistance of the floor. And obviously from a slip resistance perspective, you can measure how slippery a floor is, you can measure the dimensions of stairs, you can measure the angle, the tangent of slopes. So there's all sorts of things you can measure. And my view, certainly when it comes to safety and risk, is that we're very good at measuring the outcomes and the outputs, but we're not so good at measuring the inputs. And that's where we can make the biggest change. So we're just trying to encourage people to take a bit more of a quantifiable approach. Next point is to understand, and that's where the Chimes model comes in. So do that measurement and then try and get down into the detail of each of these 6 areas, and then we have a bit of a roadmap in terms of what we can do to improve.
Okay, so just sort of stop you there if that's okay. So from a measurement point of view, are you suggesting that it'd be good for workplaces to consider the slip rating, for example, of the shoes that they're getting people to wear, and maybe do like a test, for example, with different members of staff with different types of grip rating on their shoes, for example, and different cleaning products and that kind of thing? Is that
exactly
sort of thing you're thinking?
Yeah, exactly. So just go that level beyond what you might think, and that's where you'll have the biggest results. Rather than looking at it kind of as on the surface, just go a little bit deeper. So yeah, exactly. If you're in the position where you're considering footwear, perhaps it's time to change, or you're doing a program of renewals of footwear. Well, actually, just take a step back and say, well, do we have the right footwear? Are we specifying the right footwear? Mm-hmm. Given we're likely as a business investing in this as PPE and it's costing us money. Well, if we're going to spend money, why not spend money on
of course,
what's going to achieve the right kind of outcome?
I don't know the answer to this, but like the bigger companies, so for example, like Tesco's, for example, who employ loads of staff in their shops, and they've obviously had, as you mentioned before, a big slip fine previously. Have they got to that point where they're starting to specify grip ratings for members of staff, for example? Is that sort of where they're at, or not?
I couldn't speak to Tesco specifically, but certainly I know that certain big companies are looking at that a lot more closely. There was a trial done and some scientific evidence taken about footwear in the NHS recently. It was published a month or so ago, showing quite a significant reduction in slips and falls to NHS staff by putting in place the right footwear. So that is something that, we've seen examples, and again, we don't make or sell any footwear, so we've got no axe to grind, but we've seen examples of reducing accidents by over 80% just by getting the right footwear in place.
Wow. That's massive, isn't it? That's big impact. Okay, Brill. Sorry, I interrupted you as you went on to understand there.
No, it's always good to clarify. And so, the 3 things I would be looking at is definitely footwear. And then in terms of the floor surface, if you haven't got a slip resistance value using a pendulum test on your floor, then I'd certainly consider getting one of those, because that is invaluable insight to be able to manage the risk, but also if you've got a good score on a pendulum, then the insurers and the lawyers, like to have that evidence to enable them to defend claims. And then
do many companies have those pendulum tests proactively? I imagine
it's fairly low still, to be honest.
Yeah.
I mean, I did a series of polls on LinkedIn recently, going across sectors, and one of the questions was, have you slipped, or do you know somebody close to you, i.e., friend or family, that slipped? And it was something like 75% of people either had slipped themselves or knew somebody close to them that had slipped. Mm-hmm. And then another poll was, have you ever had a pendulum slip test in your building? And it was only about 14%. So there's quite a big discrepancy between those. And even the 14% probably aren't doing it regularly. That might include, we had one done 5 years ago when we installed the floor. But the insurers and the lawyers like to see evidence of that kind of testing annually, because if they've got a certificate which shows within 12 months of any kind of accident and claim that the floor was safe when wet, that's a very robust evidence for them to be able to defend any claims.
Excellent. And is that something you do? Is that part of the service you offer? You can do pendulum
tests? We do, yeah, exactly, yeah. So that's typically the one of the first things that we do, because we can't assume, just as I'm saying to people don't assume, we can't assume either. So we can't kind of go in there and start giving people advice without going through this methodology that we're talking about, including the measurement piece. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And what's good about doing the testing is that you can test different areas, and even you can say to somebody, let's test the pavement outside as an example, because and then you can show people a breadth of the different results on the slip resistance. So this has got a low risk when wet, this one's a medium risk, this one's a high risk, and they start to get it. Yeah, that helps to bring it to life and if you put a number on something, then you can manage it. Whereas if you're just sort of guessing, then it's quite hard to manage.
Perfect. No, really good. Okay.
So we do help people to understand, and then it's about improving. So again, that's then identifying where are we strongest, where are we weakest on the chimes, and then choosing which areas we're going to look to improve, and going into this is almost like a bit of a flywheel in the middle. So it's improve, maintain, monitor as almost a continual improvement system, because we want to keep on top of this. What we don't want to do is, for example, identify that cleaning is an issue, the deep clean, and then forget about it, because the benefit of that deep clean is only going to last so long unless we follow it up with a maintenance program and we monitor to ensure that it's actually working well over time.
Perfect, yeah.
And then that kind of flywheel helps us to produce the evidence. So, if you are standing in court and you've got to defend yourself, what's going to help you? Well, actually, the evidence of having measured and quantified stuff scientifically is going to be extremely helpful, because, how can somebody suggest that you haven't taken reasonable and practicable steps if you've gone and done scientific measurement? How can they suggest you haven't taken reasonable steps if you've got evidence of doing that risk assessment using the Chimes methodology? How can they claim that you haven't taken reasonable and practicable steps if you've implemented improvements and you've maintained and monitored that? So it's all designed around primarily trying to prevent stuff from happening in the first place. But if something does happen, positioning you to be in a very strong place to be able to bat away any claims.
Yeah, brilliant, perfect. And what sort of level of investment is a pendulum test, for example? What does that look like for companies?
So 500 quid. So in the context of for your kind of clients, that would cover pretty much all the floors they've got in their building, so they get a really good view of everything. And if we do that, we come in and we also then comment on all the other chimes as well. So you actually get a document which says, well, here's the slip resistance of the different floors as we've got them, as we found them. If any of them are not as good as they might be, we then would look to do a deep clean, little sample area, and then we test it again just to prove whether the cleaning is an issue. So you're starting to get into the solution side of things. and then we'd comment on all the other factors as well. So you get quite a lot of value from the
absolutely.
500 quid.
And considering a single claim's worth 10,000 on average, single claim. Once you're looking at multiples of people and large footfall in a certain area, it's certainly a valuable investment, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think the other thing, as you touched on earlier, is it's not just the insured cost, because your insurance only covers a certain proportion of the costs of any of these accidents. There's also all the time off and the replacement staff and the reputational risks, and there's all sorts of other things. I mean, HSE estimates, I don't know if you've ever seen their accident iceberg, but they estimate for every pound of claim costs, there's between £8 and £36 of uninsured costs. That's not specific to slips. That's across all accidents. So slips is going to be on the lower end of that, not the higher end. We did some research of about 150 health and safety leaders, and they were coming up with a banding of about 10 to 12 times. So, your 10K claim, on average, is actually leading to another 100K of costs.
100K of costs, on top. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's absolutely what I've come across as part of my study. So yeah, absolutely. No, fantastic. Okay, cool. So what is there anything else that we need to know around how to reduce slips in the workplace then, Christian?
I would just always, I suppose philosophically, I would always be a little bit mindful of what people are telling you, as in, my cleaning company tells me that they're cleaning the floors properly. Okay, that's great, but can they prove it? My footwear supplier tells me that the footwear is anti-slip. That's great, but can they prove it? My new floor supplier tells me that the floor is anti-slip. That's great, but can you prove it? So always be questioning and just, again, try and get that evidence is the mindset that I would take, because, again, if we go back to the beginning, if we look at this a bit too superficially, that's why we end up with hundreds of thousands of people a year going to hospital and hurting themselves.
Absolutely. I think the duty of care element is clear that there's a shortfall in the quality of the duty of care for the statistics to be so high, and therefore we do need to take a pragmatic approach. I really love, I've learned a great deal actually from these two models, the Chimes model and the 6-step method as well. I think that's really, really useful to get into the detail with slips. 100%, really, really appreciate it. Okay, so what sort of the next step for people then? Is if they're interested and want to learn more, what is there a call to action or anything you'd like to give us, Christian?
Yeah, definitely. So I'll leave you with two things. One is that if you'd like to understand how you're currently doing on Chimes, we've got a digital diagnostic tool you can use. It's called the Slip Safety Scorecard. And basically, you answer a series of yes/no questions. It takes 5 minutes on average. It's just a shade under 5 minutes on average. And answering questions. And basically, what you get is a 30-page report, which gives you a score for each of the Chimes, a percentage score. So you'll start to see, right, we're strongest here, we're weakest there. What can we then do to improve? And it also gives you kind of personalised recommendations as well. So, if you're strong at contamination but weak on footwear, it's going to give you 5 or 6 points on footwear, some of which we cover today, but to start to say, well, here's what you can do to improve. So that's a really useful tool. That's totally free for people to use, and you get a lot of value from that just to understand kind of where you are in your building in the real world, rather than the theory of what we're talking about on the podcast. So I'd encourage people to have a look at that. They can find that on our website, but it's slipsafety.co.uk/scorecard, and they'll find all the information there. And then the other thing, if you're interested, I've also got a podcast. If you're listening to this, you're obviously a podcast fan. I've got a podcast. I'm going to have you on as a guest shortly as well. So it's called the Safety and Risk Success Podcast. It's not just about slips and trips, it's about safety and risk broadly, but we have some really interesting discussions on there. So, if you can add a podcast onto your, if you've got extra time for listening to more podcasts, then give that a go as well.
Perfect. Yeah. So people, if you're listening, have a check on Christian's podcast. Hopefully I'll be joining soon as well to sort of share my insights as well, which is fantastic. I think that scorecard's really great free resource. So check that out, slipsafety.co.uk/scorecard. I think that's a really, really good starting point. And obviously you can self-manage from there, or you can speak to Christian about pendulum test. There's lots of different options available to you, and certainly start to use that Chimes model in your risk assessments as well. I think that's fantastic. Christian, you've been an absolute star. Thank you for joining me. Hope listeners have enjoyed this episode and it's been educational and informative. Do reach out to Christian on LinkedIn. He does share some really great content too. So for this week, take care. Catch you all soon.
Cheers.
I really hope you loved today's episode, and if you did, please make sure you subscribe and listen out for future episodes too. Please do share it across your social media channels. We hope to reach more and help more people. If you want to find out more about me, my name's Pete Rushmer. You'll find me across any social media channel and my business Flagship Partners, and we're your partners in success across your business. Thank you. See you again soon.